He told everyone I had maybe 6 weeks. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. My name is Robert Callahan, and I want to tell you what my brother did while I was lying in a hospital bed trying to decide whether to keep fighting. I want to tell you not because I need sympathy, and not because the anger still lives somewhere hot and immediate inside me. It doesn't, not anymore, but because what happened in the 14 months between my diagnosis and the morning I walked into that courtroom is the kind of story that deserves to be told completely, without softening the parts that are hard and without inflating the parts that are satisfying, even though some of them are very satisfying indeed. I was 53 years old when the diagnosis came. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, caught later than the doctors would have liked, but earlier than it often is with this particular disease, which tends to announce itself only after it has already made significant plans. My oncologist was direct and thorough and gave me information rather than comfort, which was what I needed and what I asked for. The treatment protocol was aggressive. The odds were not good, but were not impossible. And I made the decision, in the room where she explained my options with a model of the human digestive system on the shelf behind her, that I was going to pursue treatment fully and deal with the administrative realities of my situation at the same time, because I am an accountant by profession and a pragmatist by nature, and I understood that if the treatment failed, the people I loved would need things to be in order. I had built a life of moderate but genuine substance. A house in Asheville, North Carolina, that I had owned outright for 8 years. A retirement portfolio that reflected 3 decades of disciplined saving. A small investment property in the mountains that had appreciated considerably since I purchased it in my early 40s. And a business, a small accounting and financial planning practice with 12 steady clients and a reputation in my community that had taken many years of careful and honest work to construct. None of this was a fortune by certain definitions, but it was mine, and it represented everything I had spent my adult life building in the quiet, consistent way that never makes headlines but makes a life. I had one sibling, my brother, Gary Callahan, 50 years old at the time of my diagnosis, 3 years younger than me, and the person I had called first when the doctor's office left the message that changed the calendar of my life. He had cried, or he had produced the sounds associated with crying, which I now understand are not always the same thing. He had driven up from Greenville within hours. He had sat beside me in the hospital during the first rounds of testing and had held my hand in a waiting room while a scan machine assessed the interior of my body for information I was afraid to receive. I had believed, completely and without reservation, that my brother was present with me in the way that people who love each other are present during catastrophic moments. I now know that during one of those early visits, while I was in with a specialist and Gary was alone in my house with a set of keys I had given him for emergencies, he photographed the location of my filing cabinet. He came back 2 weeks later when I was admitted for my first treatment cycle. He used a locksmith he had found 40 minutes outside of Asheville, far enough that the name wouldn't register in our shared community, to open the cabinet. He removed my will. He took it to a document preparation service in a city I had never visited, operated by a man whose name would surface later in the investigation, and he had it altered. The alterations were specific and surgical. The property distributions that had previously directed my estate to a combination of longtime friends, a charitable organization I had supported for years, and a modest trust one had established for my neighbor's daughter who was in her first year of college, all of it was redirected. To Gary. Entirely and exclusively to Gary. The charitable bequest, gone. The trust for the young woman who had mowed my lawn for 3 years and called me Mr. Robert and deserved every dollar I had set aside for her, gone. The shares of the practice, which I had intended to transfer to my junior partner Diane, who had worked beside me for 9 years and whose professional future I had specifically and deliberately protected in that document, gone. He replaced the altered document in my filing cabinet and returned my keys to the hook by the front door. He sent me a text message that evening asking how I was feeling and whether I needed anything from the store. I did not know any of this. I was in a hospital bed trying to keep food down and managing the particular variety of fear that arrives when your body becomes a contested territory between disease and medicine, and you are not sure which one is going to win. The treatment was brutal in the way that treatment for serious cancer is brutal, Not dramatically, not in the way of sudden crisis, but in the slow, grinding attrition of energy and certainty. There were weeks where I could not read. There were days where forming a coherent sentence required an effort I didn't always have. My world contracted to the dimensions of immediate necessity. Eating, resting, managing medication, allowing people to help me in ways I had previously been unwilling to accept because I had spent 53 years being the person other people leaned on, and the reversal of that arrangement required a kind of surrender I had to learn. Gary was present throughout. He called regularly. He visited once a month. He managed, with practiced sincerity, the performance of devoted brotherhood, asking questions about my treatment, sitting with me during difficult afternoons, helping with practical tasks around the house on weekends when I was home between cycles. He told our cousins in Maryland that things were progressing poorly. He told my father's surviving sister, Aunt Marjorie, who was 81 and lived in a care facility in Knoxville, and loved us both in the uncomplicated way of a woman from a generation that believed family was sacred, that the doctors were not optimistic. He told people, consistently, and with what appeared to be grieving reluctance, that he did not expect me to make it. He was constructing a consensus. He was making sure that when the estate went to probate, the emotional landscape was already prepared. He was managing the narrative of my death with the same attention to detail he had applied to the document in my filing cabinet. What Gary had not managed was my oncologist. Dr. Patricia Osei was not a person who traded in narrative. She traded in data. And the data, around the end of my 4th treatment cycle, began to shift in a direction that nobody, including, with genuine professional candor, Dr. Osei herself, had predicted with confidence. The tumor, which had been aggressive and well-established when we began, was responding. Not completely, not cleanly, but measurably, undeniably, in the direction of reduction. My blood work began to reflect a body that was fighting with increasing effectiveness. My energy, which had been at a sustained low for months, began to return in increments that I noticed first, and then my care team confirmed. By month 7, the word the doctors were using with increasing frequency was remarkable. By month 9, the word was unexpected. By month 11, when I sat in Dr. Osei's office and looked at the most recent imaging results laid against the earliest ones, the word she used was the one I had not allowed myself to say aloud because I was afraid of what it would cost me emotionally if I had to take it back. She said remission, not cured. Oncologists are careful people, and remission is not a word they equate with resolution. There would be monitoring. There would be follow-up. There would be years of watchfulness. But the disease that had been advancing through my body with apparent intention had been stopped and was retreating, and I was sitting in a chair in a doctor's office in Asheville, North Carolina, on an afternoon in March, alive in a way I had not been certain of for nearly a year. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I made a pot of coffee I didn't drink. And eventually I got up, went to my filing cabinet, and took out my will, not because anything had prompted specific suspicion, but because surviving has a way of making you want to look at the documents that govern your death. You want to make them current. You want to make them true. I read it sitting at my kitchen table, and I understood, within 4 minutes of beginning to read, that the document in my hands was not the document I had signed. The specific language in the charitable bequest section was wrong. I am an accountant. I have read more financial and legal documents than most people encounter in their entire lives. I know what my own intentions look like rendered in formal language, because I was present when that language was constructed, and I reviewed the document twice before signing it. What was in front of me was close but not exact, and not exact, when you are reading your own will, is a distinction with the weight of a verdict. I read it again. I set it down. I picked it up and read it a 3rd time. Then I called my attorney. Her name was Patricia Wren. She had drafted the original will and retained a copy in her office files, which is standard practice, and which Gary had either not known about or had not thought through with sufficient care, which would prove to be the first of several significant oversights in his planning. Patricia came to my house that evening. She brought her copy. We placed the 2 documents side by side on my kitchen table and read them in parallel silence for nearly 20 minutes. She made notes. She was very still. She had been practicing estate law for 27 years, and she had an expression I had not seen on her before, which was the expression of a person in the presence of something that has confirmed a category of human behavior she had studied professionally but hoped not to encounter personally. She told me what we were looking at. She told me what it meant legally. She told me what the next steps would need to be, and what they would require from me, and approximately how long and how difficult the process would be. And then she asked me if I knew who might have done this. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the 2 documents on the table. I thought about the keys I had given Gary. I thought about the afternoon I had been in with the specialist while he was alone in my house. I thought about the locksmith 40 minutes outside of Asheville, whose name I didn't know yet but would. I thought about every phone call in which Gary had told someone I wasn't going to make it, with a sorrow in his voice that I had heard as love. I told Patricia I had a strong suspicion. I told her I wanted to be certain before I said it out loud as an accusation. She understood. She told me how to get certain. The investigation that followed was quiet and thorough and took 3 months. Patricia retained a forensic document examiner. The examination of the altered will identified markers consistent with document manipulation, specific characteristics of the paper, the ink distribution in the signature block, microscopic irregularities in the formatting that resulted from the document being printed, altered, and reprinted using equipment that was close to but not identical to the original. The examiner's report was detailed and specific and would hold up to professional scrutiny because it was based on physical evidence that did not require interpretation. A private investigator, Patricia, recommended, located the document preparation service through a combination of financial records and geographic cross-referencing that I will not detail completely because the specifics are less important than the outcome. The operator of that service, when contacted by law enforcement, which became involved when Patricia took the evidence to the district attorney's office, was considerably more forthcoming than Gary had presumably anticipated. He had records. He had been paid by check. By Gary Callahan, with a personal check drawn on Gary's account, which is the kind of detail that makes investigators close their notebooks and exhale slowly. Gary did not know I was in remission until the morning I called him. I had waited deliberately. I had wanted the evidence complete and the legal process initiated before I had that conversation, because I knew Gary and I knew that forewarning would produce immediate defensive action. The movement of assets, the construction of alternative explanations, the lawyering up that transforms a clear case into a complicated one. I wanted the clarity preserved. I called him on a Thursday morning in June, 14 months after my diagnosis. He answered on the 3rd ring. He sounded the way he always sounded, warm in the practiced way, slightly careful in the particular manner of a person who has been careful for a long time. I told him the doctors were saying I was in remission. There was a pause. A specific kind of pause. Not the pause of a brother overwhelmed by relief. The pause of a person rapidly recalculating a situation that had just changed in a direction they were not prepared for. He said that was incredible. He said he was so relieved. He said he'd been praying for this. He said it with the right words in the right order and zero conviction underneath any of them, and I had spent 14 months in proximity to my own death, which does something permanent to your ability to tolerate things that are not real. I told him I knew about the will. I told him I had Patricia's copy, and I had the forensic report, and I had his name on a check to a document preparation service in a city 3 hours from Asheville. I told him the district attorney's office had opened an investigation, and I told him that I was alive, which meant that none of it had worked, and that the only thing it had accomplished was the destruction of something between us that I had believed until 8 months ago was real. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said my name. Just my name, the way people say it when they don't have anything else. I told him I had nothing more to say to him personally, and that anything further should go through his attorney. Then I ended the call. The case went to trial 11 months later. Gary had retained a defense attorney who pursued the expected strategies, challenging the forensic examiner's methodology, questioning the document preparation operator's credibility, constructing a narrative in which Gary had been misled or misunderstood or had acted out of genuine concern for the estate's integrity during what he believed was his brother's final illness. The narrative was creative, and it was presented with professional skill, and it collapsed under the weight of a personal check with Gary Callahan's signature and account number and the name of a document manipulation service in a city he had claimed never to have visited. I walked into that courtroom on a Tuesday morning in clear health and full composure. I had taken the stand twice during the proceedings. I testified to the contents of my original will and my intentions in each provision, and I testified to the sequence of events as I had experienced them and as the investigation had confirmed them. I was not emotional on the stand. I was precise. I am an accountant. Precision is my native language. Gary sat at the defense table through all of it. He looked at me twice during my testimony. The first time, I looked back steadily and without expression. The second time, he looked away first. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. They returned a verdict on a Wednesday afternoon. Guilty on the count of will fraud. Guilty on the count of forgery. Guilty on the count of elder and vulnerable person exploitation, a charge that applied because the crime had been committed against a person in a documented medical crisis, which the law in North Carolina treats with appropriate seriousness. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2.5. Mandatory restitution for the legal costs I had incurred. A permanent record that would follow Gary Callahan through every professional and personal context for the remainder of his life. His attorney read a statement Gary had prepared expressing remorse. Gary did not read it himself. He sat at the defense table and stared at the surface in front of him while his attorney's voice delivered words that might or might not have been true and that arrived, in either case, several months too late to matter. I did not read a victim impact statement. I had written one, and then, the night before sentencing, decided not to deliver it. Everything I needed to say had been said in the courtroom. Everything that needed to be on the record was on the record. I did not need to perform the conclusion of a story that had already concluded. What I thought about in those weeks after the sentencing, and what I still think about, with a frequency that has gradually decreased but has not reached zero, is not Gary. It is the document on my kitchen table. The will that was not my will. The charitable bequest that was removed. The trust for a young woman who had no knowledge she was ever in it or ever removed from it. The future of a junior partner who had given 9 years to our shared practice and whose professional security had been deleted from a legal document while I was connected to a treatment drip in a hospital room fighting for my life. I had those provisions reinstated the morning after I sat with Patricia and compared documents. They had never been legally valid in the altered version. The original, held in Patricia's office, had never been superseded, but I wanted them reaffirmed and updated and signed in front of witnesses in a room where no one could touch them. Diane, my junior partner, now owns 50% of our practice. The trust for the young woman who called me Mr. Robert is fully funded and in the hands of a trustee Patricia recommended. The charitable organization received a donation last spring that was larger than what I had initially designated because I was alive to write the check myself. I still live in the house in Asheville. I have my monitoring appointments every 4 months and I have, to date, remained in remission. I work 3 days a week. I take Fridays off, which I never did before and which I now consider non-negotiable, because 14 months of confronting your own mortality teaches you certain lessons about time that cannot be unlearned. I spend Friday mornings in the garden, which I had always meant to tend properly, and had never found the time for before time became something I understood differently. I don't talk to Gary. I don't write to him. I don't think about him in the way I used to think about him. As a person I was connected to by blood and history and the accumulated weight of a shared childhood. That connection was real once. I don't dispute that it was real. But he made a choice in my filing cabinet on a night when I was in a hospital bed, and the choice was not made in a moment of weakness or desperation or temporary lapse in judgment. It was made with planning and execution and sustained deception across 14 months. You don't forgive that the way you forgive ordinary failures. It is not that kind of thing. What I have is the morning. Every morning that I wake up in my house in Asheville and make coffee I actually drink and sit in a kitchen where the filing cabinet holds a will that is entirely and accurately mine is a morning that his plan did not account for. He had planned for my death. He had built a structure designed to benefit from my absence, and I had the considerable satisfaction, which I will not pretend is not a satisfaction, of being absent for none of it, of walking into every room he assumed I would never walk into again, of sitting in that courtroom, in good health, watching the structure he had built with my death as its foundation be taken apart brick by people whose job it is to dismantle exactly that kind of thing. He told everyone I had maybe 6 weeks. I have had considerably more than that. I intend to have considerably more still. And every single day of them belongs to me. Only, entirely, and exactly the way I always intended. That was never something he could change. He just didn't know it yet.